So hey anime fans. The series name is What If Naruto Got Harem with High School. So let's start the series. His blank eyes pierced the peeling white paint. Beside him, he heard rustling, and he knew she was there, even though she was not dangerous because she had been there all night. He heard her return to the bathroom, put on her underwear, and start brushing her teeth. He overcame the psychological sensation of inhaling something other than air, such as breathing underwater, but it took some time. The stick of poison was delivered to his lips by pale fingers, and he took a drag. He thought it wouldn't affect him anyhow, so he disregarded all the caution indications on the package. He waited a bit longer than needed for the smoke to go into his lungs, swirling it around in his mouth. The flavor was awful. How could anyone enjoy the taste of household chemicals that have been ground up and sprayed onto paper or onto dried branches? He knew he didn't have a headache, but it was hot and dry. The burn of the heat in his chest felt nice. The smoke floated into his nostrils as he breathed, and the smell was bad. How fitting that after inhaling something so awful, he can still recall the scent from the day. Naruto. Gradually, the lifeless blue, nearly gray eyes shifted to the other individual in the room. A girl with brown hair stood there looking quite pretty. Her face was striated with freckles and hidden makeup, making her look like a raccoon, and her nose was too small for her eyes. She smiled hesitantly at him and inquired, "Where did you say you put the money again?" He resisted the impulse to sigh, closed his early vacant eyes, took a final suck from his cigarette, and then raked his fingers through his long, shaggy, pale blonde hair before placing it in the ashtray next to his bed. He needed to take care of it, or rather, he needed a haircut. Even though his hair was no longer greasy, he was happy with the way it appeared as long as it didn't annoy him. He didn't care if it looked fashionable anymore. He almost gave a snort. Ignoring the cold air on his naked body, he stood up for the day, stretched his legs, and strode coldly past the girl in the room. Moving through his neat but run-down flat, he eventually found his wallet, a simple black wallet, and removed several bills, placing them on the counter without bothering to give them to her. He walked past her again and got a drink from the refrigerator. He selected a brown bottle and used his own hands to pry off the metal cap. He tasted the burn of a learned taste as he gulped the bitter beverage. Drinking so early. After taking another sip, he looked at his companion, who was now dressed and putting his money in his pocket. With one hand on her hip, she seemed unhappy with him. Gazing out of his kitchen window, he remarked, "Ah, it looked nice out." She sighed and removed the beer bottle from his hand, taking a sip for herself. He simply observed her while staring at her. Then she gave the bottle back to him. "You're hopeless, you know that." He groaned in response, drained the last of the alcohol from his palm, and placed the bottle beside his sink. After that, he left the girl in his room and walked to his bathroom, but he was briefly stopped when a hand softly grasped his wrist. He didn't look in her direction. "We'll do this next month, yeah." She was a lost soul, broken by the world around her, who had been wandering the streets giving herself to anyone who would take her. He had met her roughly a year ago. Naruto had just approached her, given her a sizable sum of money, and instructed her to visit his residence once a month. He always paid in advance, and he would cover the cost of a taxi for her the following morning. He genuinely glanced over his shoulder at her this time, and while she appeared optimistic, she was also dejected. Even though he was unaware of it, he could see the underlying layer in her gaze. She just knew his name since it was on his mailbox. He didn't even know hers. It was merely two souls in need of a little physical break from whatever it was they were both coping with. It wasn't romantic. He never explained anything to her, and she never questioned him. She didn't want him to ask because it was better that way, and he did the same for her. His gaze flicked to her hand and back again as if she were about to be attacked, and he half turned to look at her. He could see she was nervous and that she did this every time she felt she had gone too far. It was pathetic. "Yes, next month." He gave her a simple nod. After she released a breath she was unaware she had been holding and grinned subtly, Naruto turned and walked away. He didn't respond as he heard her say goodbye and open the door to his apartment. Has he done this before? though. He has, in fact. He examined his face, observing the 3 lifeless-looking whisker-like marks on each cheek and the tiny strand of hair growing on his chin. Though he wasn't sure he could prove it right now, he believed they had been much darker in the past. Maybe he should straighten the white hair that dangled in front of his eyes. He clipped a section of his bangs to the right length using the scissors he kept by the kitchen sink. He nodded now that he could see fully. He could feel his hair touching the base of his neck, but it was too short for a ponytail, and it was definitely long, scruffy, and uneven. He had his ears covered, but it didn't bother him. Entering his shower, he quickly and efficiently took a shower. He looked at the clock and reflected that this was when homeroom would have started. He pondered skipping today due to the inconvenience, but there wasn't anything spectacular to do, perhaps aside from drawing more memories, so he thought, oh, Sensei is going to chew him out again. He ran to his room and changed into a plain white t-shirt and his school uniform, which were cheap and readily available. Naruto grabbed his rucksack and stuffed many shuriken and kunai into different covert holsters. Since they would appear to be tribal tattoos to the normal person, no one ever questioned the series of seals he had inked on his left forearm. All of the objects carried by these seals were either important to him or something he held close to his heart. One of the seals on the palm of his left hand held his old headband. He started to walk to school after pulling out his pack and taking a cigarette from it. His mind wandered as he traveled to Kuo Academy. As the most socially acceptable method to remind himself that he was still alive, he had kind of created this as a coping technique, even though he probably shouldn't have smoked another one so quickly. Having killed Kaguya 3 years before, he had arrived bloodied and defeated, but he had not won the war. No, he had not won anything. No one had rescued Naruto as he crawled into an alley after he had crashed on the streets, struggling to breathe. As onlookers decided to ignore him, he slowly recovered. He had once been ejected by the store owner who picked up the trash every night and told him to quit being a burden on the community. What an unclean place. He was dirty, smelly, and broken. He hardly had the energy to leave the alley, much less search for something more sustaining. His wounds had unfortunately been severe enough to kill him. He could still recall how sore he was when he stood to his full height, stretching, and stepping out of the alley. The rubbish beside him was the only source of food for him. He was surprised to discover that this planet appeared to speak the same language as him, despite the fact that it was slightly different. But he soon realized that he was the odd one out, and he never really paid attention to his accent. Determining to learn more about this realm and work on his accent, he had stumbled off. He had reached Japan, a vast nation with many different races, nations, and faiths. Even though there was a lot more violence in his universe, he was still amazed by the diversity. It was a bigger world. The simplest answer is that he had shut his subconscious off from the hairy beast and didn't want to discuss him, but he still had his core energy and could use Kurume's core energy. How could he face his friend and partner and let them know how totally he had failed? He couldn't. Consequently, he didn't. Kuo Town, an interesting name, is the town where Naruto was. He had heard about the money, which they called yen, and the place itself was rather big, maybe a bit smaller than Hyde Village. It resembled his Ryo world quite a bit. His information collection was greatly aided by his shadow clones. Shinobi and ninja are extinct today, but they did exist in this planet. The United States of America, a global power, essentially destroyed Japan's military, which they called a defense force. The ninja there, who were known as assassins or killers and who wielded kunai and shuriken, appeared to be strictly spirit art practitioners who were ignorant of any otherworldly abilities. This universe's ninjas were considerably different from Naruto's, despite their similarities. He learned that money was what he needed most. Money was the foundation of this world. It was less about your strength and who could beat you up and more about who you know and how you played in the world. Compared to the society he was accustomed to, this one was very different. He regretted attempting to live in a different reality, but he was powerless to alter this. Psychologically, he was not incapable of taking his own life. They say it's simple to die, but hard to live. His eyes adapted to his surroundings before he realized he was at the school door, and he was sick of murder and bloodshed. He had detested this place, my God. Luckily, there was nobody strolling about the campus because classes had started. Academy of Kuo. He was in his last year of primary, middle, high, and university education at the prestigious institution. This time he might be held back. He would have to improve his grades significantly enough to show that he had no plans to go back. Not because he detested the school or the lessons per se, but rather because his younger self would scream in dismay and contempt. In the past, he hated learning and preferred to be outside playing or training. He's quite objective now, and it's a nice change of pace from the routine and boredom of civilian life. He seemed to be living in a realm of gray, where only black and white hues coexisted. What he detested most about the academy were its people. He hated the kids, many of whom believed they owned the sky and were immersed in their own tiny universes. Give him some room, please. Being understandably late for the opening ceremony on his first day of school, he interrupted the good luck speech given by the principal. He approached a lone chair and fell down on it right away, closing his eyes in tiredness. He had to work double the night before, which wasn't his fault, and doing this was likely to spark some gossip. Next to him was a pretty-looking female. "He smells like cigarettes, so gross," she said loudly as she turned to face him. Then she pushed her chair away from him and gave him a look he had seen a lot as a kid. They immediately wrote him off as a delinquent. When you factor in his disheveled appearance, tattoos, blonde hair, and unkempt clothes, he had already made a name for himself in 2 minutes. All he wanted was to get away from these guys and finish this whole thing. Naturally, his image as a delinquent had led many to decide to put him in his place. In an effort to establish their dominance over someone they felt was completely beneath them, students attempted to physically assault him. What an unclean place. Naruto attempted to ignore the abuse and lead a typical high school life after it had been going on for a week. He became easily irritated after a week, and it only took one try to get the other pupils to stop teasing him. He crushed their arms when they attempted to steal money from him to use for lunch. At least physically, they haven't touched him since. They just employed verbal abuse, which Naruto could also handle with ease, because they believed that he wouldn't retaliate if they didn't break a barrier. "Oh look, it's him again. The stupidest one of us. It's the delinquent. Shh, he'll hear us and beat us up. What a piece of shit. How could anyone act the way he does? He's so gross. I heard he works for the Yakuza. He doesn't care. An asshole, that's what he is. I heard he's an orphan. I bet he killed his parents. If I were his mother, I think I'd rather just kill myself than have him as a son. Maybe that's what happened. His dad probably raped his mom, and she just left him. He's a monster." At first, he was surprised at how dark some of their whispers might get, but he disregarded it right away, as he normally does, and continued living his life. Naruto pulled out his peach-made tube and headed toward his homeroom down the empty hallways. He concluded that if he just looked down and ignored what they were saying, it would be simpler to handle and less bothersome. He noted that he should never stare someone in the eye because, for whatever reason, it just makes them feel something, and their normally calm face becomes a grimace of hatred. Maybe this wasn't another universe. Maybe it was hell, and he was being tortured for what he did. Maybe he doesn't care. Maybe he is a piece of shit. Maybe he is an asshole. Perhaps he is a monster. He simply needs to put up with them for another year, and then it will all be over. It doesn't matter anymore and it won't ever answer. He will, and he may do it easily, but all he will have to do is live up to the name they gave him. Whether it was out of sympathy or some other evil feeling, he could count on one hand the number of kids who were completely uninterested in him, even pleasant. He could, however, tolerate certain pupils who didn't give a damn about whether they detested him or not. Despite his ability to stay as silent as the night thanks to his shinobi training, Naruto turned on his music and stopped in front of his classroom door, secretly opening it. Regretfully, his sensei would still announce his presence, not him. "Uzumaki, late again today." Naruto took off his headphones and approached his desk in the rear at a leisurely pace. There were scratches and scrawls all over his desk, along with derogatory remarks. He even grunted at the teacher and tossed away the used tissue that was on it. Teshima Erato frowned at Uzumaki Naruto, his most unruly child. The youngster spent the entire day thinking and sleeping, completely engrossed in his own universe. The blonde only received passing grades and was hardly making enough progress to graduate from high school, but Teshima still wanted to connect with the boy and see him thrive. In spite of his harsh and frequently angry demeanor, the sensei was a tall, well-built, slightly overweight man who was passionate. He happened to be focusing on physical education, and he had black hair and wore a blue shirt to school. Teshima could see that Naruto was physically fit and worked out a lot, but he would have been a fantastic athlete who could have outperformed everyone else at this school. But for some reason, he acted as though he was a little better than average in his class, and he never grasped the enigma of Uzumaki Naruto. Because he had a soft place for the youngster, he went to his attendance log and marked Naruto as present rather than absent, even though he could have written him off as late once more. Teshima was unsure of what it was that Teshima observed, but Naruto's appearance, lack of emotion, and lack of expression weren't normal, and he avoided the entire school community, with a few exceptions. He was so troubled by everything that he realized he needed to take action. What was it Teshima thought he needed to do? He was unaware, but he could hear the classmates taunting and being blatantly cruel to the child. He tried hard to stop it, but it didn't work for the first year. Naruto would have been expelled long ago if not for the teacher. He was always late, at least twice or 3 times a week, and it was intolerable. He had also observed the youngster smoking, which was prohibited at a school that does not allow tobacco use. He filled in for the blonde, but that alone might have led to major issues for the institution. He wished he could do more to assist him, but sometimes fate handled things terribly. He sighed and pinched the bridge of his nose. "Takagi, please give him your notes after class for everything he missed," he requested. The girl Teshima mentioned scoffed a little as she crossed her arms spitefully. "But sensei, I don't even write notes, I just memorize anything you tell us that I don't already know," she replied. Teshima felt his eyebrow twitch and turned to face the class's second-ranked student. "Hajime, please give Uzumaki your notes after class," Teshima said. The girl closed her pink eyelashes and replied, "Hi sensei," with a beautiful grin. She spoke in a honey-like, syrupy voice. Naruto's eyes wandered to the 2 pupils who had been named. Kuo Academy student Takagi Saya, who referred to herself as a genius, had every right to do so as she received the highest grades in the school and, according to rumors, placed among the top 10 nationally. She had a keen mind behind her golden and piercing eyes. She had a pretty body, little but still developing, and her hair was pulled up in 2 ponytails. She would have been an amazing shinobi, but he could see she wasn't properly taught. She may have possessed a mind as sharp as Shikamaru's, but her attitude of absolute dominance made him not want to talk to her at all. After mentally assessing Takagi Saya, a habit he had unconsciously developed to keep his mind busy and avoid boredom, he turned his attention to the other female. Hajime Akeno, the other female, was really gorgeous. To acknowledge the shameful title of Great Ladies of Kuo, she was one of the 2. There was a touch of combat-ready muscle tone beneath her gorgeous figure. There was another aspect of her that simply resonated with his intuition, a type of energy that was unquestionably not core energy. Naturally, she had never spoken about this at all and had kept it to herself. She nearly annoyed him with her long, black hair styled in a single ponytail. "You hear that, Uzumaki? Make sure you copy those notes, and please don't be late again," his sensei remarked, as he turned back to face him. Naruto put his head on the desk and looked out the window to his right. "Hi sensei," he said. He almost snorted each time Teshima-sensei said, "Please don't be late again," as though that would actually happen. Why the man kept saying that, as though something would finally change and make him a perfect pupil, was beyond him. Naruto had the impression that his entire body was in a grinder and that he was being abandoned on the street, where the dirt, rodents, and insects would tear at his body and soul. He was tired and had not slept well since coming into this world and since he had woken up. The past could not be altered. Then Naruto went to sleep. Since he didn't unpack, he was fortunate not to have to pack anything because the other students had already started packing up. When the noon bell rang, he just got up, picked up his bag, plugged in his earbuds, and walked out of the room. Oh, he didn't mean to fall asleep today, he murmured, raising his head and blotting the saliva from his mouth. He continued to walk, keeping his eyes down and focusing more on hips and feet than faces, ignoring Hajime-san's attempt to give him her notes. One of the great ladies was walking down the hall, and he could hear the fanboys and fangirls squealing with glee. What a joke. Even though he could hear some irate whispers aimed at him, it wasn't too bad. He could see her coming, and he had heard his music at school. Naruto just smiled with pleasure as she yelled his name and pleaded with him to stay awake. Naruto thought to himself, oh no, Hajime-san, I'm listening to music, and I can't hear you, or talk to you, ever. Now, please go away. Naruto quickened his steps just enough to be farther away from her, but not enough to be noticeable. I hoped she wouldn't be too stubborn and would just let him go. Uzumaki-san. He tensed as the girl with the black hair grasped his wrist. His body was fighting automatically, but he struggled to resist the desire. Akeno might have been a little irritated, wondering whether he didn't hear her or if the blonde miscreant was purposefully ignoring her. She was as graceful and lovely as ever, smiling all the time, and she heard the praise she received as she walked past the students. The blonde and she had only ever spoken briefly before, but from what she remembers, it was incredibly impolite and ended quickly. She had no doubt that the blonde would be able to hear the awful and obviously nasty things that some of the students were saying to him as he went by, or even murmuring to him. She frowned at the treatment of the delinquent. She shouted at him again, a bit more loudly than normal. She may have said that she had been looking for an excuse to talk to him for a while, or that she was only doing this because the teacher had instructed her to give him the notes. Since the opening ceremony, she had been intrigued in him, but the more she watched him, the more she wanted to talk to him face to face. She had only talked to him once, when he had accidentally bumped into her last year. It wasn't what the world saw every day that she was talking about, but there was something strange about him, in fact, quite different. Perhaps it would have been preferable to heed to his request, but she had fought the temptation to assist nonetheless. However, she was taken aback to discover a pack of cigarettes on the floor near everything, and she felt compelled to pick them up and light them immediately. He was really annoyed that the contents of their luggage had spilled on the floor. He muttered a few curses and told her to get out of his way. She smiled at him, took them up, and extended them for him to accept. After a brief moment of hesitation, Naruto took them from her without saying thank you and packed the remainder of his suitcase. When he stood up, she was taken aback by his height. He might have been 5'10", but when his eyes briefly locked with hers, she realized that something wasn't quite right about Uzumaki Naruto. And that was exactly what she was looking at again. His eyes could hold your attention, but not because they were pretty. Because they were so depressed. It was sad for someone to have such lifeless eyes, for such a beautiful color blue, to look so gray. Most people would say that his eyes were completely empty, devoid of any emotion, carefully hidden away behind a blank visage. But to her, to someone who had experienced something like this where she didn't want people to ask, she thought they were sad. For a while, she would see that look in a mirror every day. This time, she had finally noticed faint lines on his cheeks, 3 on each cheek, which almost looked like whisker marks, giving him this wild, almost exotic look. His eyebrows looked perfectly natural, so he didn't dye his hair at the time. Her eyes then shifted to the shape of his face, which was angular but boyish, with stray stubble resting on his chin, surprising her a little at the facial hair. Uzumaki Naruto was by no means an ugly person, but his unkempt hairstyle and his terrible, hollow face were a great turn-off. Maybe he could get a haircut and get a tan. If his blue eyes were actually blue and he smiled a little, she could picture him as absolutely handsome. Can you calm down? At one point, his voice was deep, but not that deep. It was quiet and dominating, and it made her stop thinking. He had taken out one of his earbuds and was holding on to it. I'm sorry, Uzumaki-san. I just found such unusual eyes fascinating, she added, grinning and taking his wrist off. Akeno noticed that he was much calmer after she released him. Was he afraid of being touched? Why was he so tense? Naruto was silent for a while before responding. Have you attempted to give me the notes? Unable to understand what he was talking about, Akeno blinked, but then she remembered why she had come to find him, and she almost blushed with humiliation at forgetting, mentally noting how he changed the subject immediately. She answered, yes, I was, reaching into her bag to retrieve her notepad. Save it, I won't copy them anyway, he answered, dismissing her attempt with a raised palm. She smiled at him. But Uzumaki-san, you should worry more about your studies. I've heard some interesting things about you, and quite frankly, you don't look like half the idiot as some of the students like to call you. Some people just don't care about school names like the great ladies of Kuo, but she could almost be certain that everyone knew who Uzumaki Naruto was, the great delinquent of Kuo Academy, and that it was social suicide to talk to the blonde for personal reasons, and she made sure to talk louder so the students around her could hear her smile. Naruto's aura made him troublesome. He was small, but if you look closely and pay attention, you could say that he was intimidating. His mannerisms, his awareness of his surroundings, and his seeming total disregard for everything that happened around him made Naruto intimidating to Hajime Akeno. He seems to be an expert at ignoring what people think of him, and it worried her to be so used to such harsh remarks at such a young age. That is why she finds it surprising that he is able to handle so much of the school's mockery so well. She smiled at him again, a little softer this time. I would like to get to know you as well, Uzumaki-san. This time, Naruto's face shifted a little, but she could still see it well, his lips slightly parted, his eyes a little larger, and she could read it so well that it may as well have been a book. Naruto was surprised. The honest expression on her face, which matched her honest words, must have been the first honest thing he had ever seen in her. He was astonished by the words that came out of her mouth, shocked that she had even begun a polite discussion, and shocked that she had even heard of his existence. He blinked once and pushed his face back into a blank stare before ripping his eyes from her. Why would anyone want to do that? Hajime-san. Is there something wrong with the question? Asked with a smile and a lovely head tilt. He nodded briefly before heading out in the hopes of avoiding all of these people because it's beginning to wear him down. Wait, Uzumaki-san. She quickly passed him and stayed by his side, staring up at him, Akeno said, blinking as he started to leave her. Did my reaction bother you? Naruto nodded again, trying to put some distance between them. I don't want anyone to know me, ever, he murmured. Akeno frowned and spoke suddenly, obviously angered by her, adding, don't you sound evasive. For someone who seems so lonely, it's pretty surprising. She didn't think Naruto would completely stop moving this time. Faces and pictures flooded his head at once. He was surrounded by his family and friends. Was he alone? His sanity and the only genuine link he had to the people he had left behind were, of course, his loneliness. How can he be allowed to live while they're all dead? The response is simple: he isn't. He would undoubtedly feel lonely if he weren't being punished by God. But that's his salvation, not a problem. Given that he killed them, why is he allowed to have additional friends and family? Ignoring Akeno's surprise, Naruto straightened up. In an attempt to avoid frowning, he turned to face her and gave her a little, unkind smile. Goodbye, Hajime-san. He didn't move slowly, didn't turn around, and left her there. No, he didn't want friends and it didn't matter anymore, therefore he had to leave. Why go through that pain again when everyone moves away and dies? His fist was clenched, and he wanted to turn around and talk to Hajime-san again, but he stubbornly refused to recognize it. His decision to leave Akeno required a tremendous amount of strength. He didn't understand. He just wanted to get out of the situation. His chest constricted and his eyes pinched. No, he won't, he concluded. He wouldn't let himself. With a groan, He put his hands in his pockets and went outside. I guess it was true. He's not very good at a standing conversation yet. There are so many feelings that he just hasn't dealt with yet. Naruto grumbled with annoyance. He knew that he had handled it poorly, and he didn't need to take any frustration on Hajime-san. He was just stupid. On the track field, a small group of boys were playing soccer, kicking the ball back and forth between themselves while laughing. The pleasant breeze brushed against Naruto's face as he briefly closed his eyes. What a beautiful day it is. The wind was flowing through his blonde hair, and it seemed as though nature was revisiting past experiences. He stopped and glanced around at the many high school students who were grinning, laughing, and generally enjoying themselves. For an instant, he saw Hyde Village before him in all its majestic splendor, with buildings and an intact statue to the headmaster in its place. His eyelids fluttered open as he struggled to control the wave of disappointment, and he felt a tug on his lips, barely able to hold back a nostalgic smile. On a hill near the school building, he stood beside a tree overlooking the pupils in the quad, with the tennis courts behind him. It was neither Hyde Village nor home. The more he saw the students playing, the less he smiled. He understood what he was missing and had it before: a home, friends, family, and a future he could look forward to. He was inspired to make it as flawless as possible by this future. He desired a tranquil existence, where his children could play soccer like the children in front of him. Unfortunately, since he was solely to blame, that couldn't have been. He could have noticed it if he had been stronger. Because he had been too weak, he had suffered greatly. He might even suggest that he would have been better off dead. He could admit that his current situation wasn't much better than death, but his buddies would never have forgiven him if he had just given up. Naruto sat down and got out his food, sketchbook, and sketching supplies. After taking a bite out of it, he looked down at the boys playing soccer and switched to a new page. He will draw inspiration from them. He could picture himself playing with Moji, Udon, and Hyde Village Amaru as a child. Oh, that was such a good time. After thinking to himself, I wonder if any of them would approve of the way I'm coping right now, he drew a line. It was his own hand that moved. He made several clones after arriving here and taught them everything he knows about drawing and painting. He picked up decades worth of artistic methods in about a year. He did everything he could to retain his memories. Never in his life did he want to wake up unable to see his home. He had to acknowledge that he wasn't artistic and that this was something he had never been interested in before. After all, that was all he had left of them. So Naruto wouldn't let it go and wanted to see and recall their faces. He had his old clothes, all worn and ruined, his ninja tools, like his kunai and shuriken, and his scrolls, of which he was fortunately able to produce more here. His house didn't exist in this world, and he didn't have any pictures of it. The idea was merely a fleeting concept for a high school student. Among his most cherished possessions were these paintings, his Hide-8, and the headband he had obtained from Iruka-sensei, the first person to ever identify him as Uzumaki Naruto rather than Kobe no Kitsune. He couldn't blame Kurama anymore, but just now he couldn't bring himself to talk to that old jackass in public. Maybe one day. When he heard a loud voice approaching him, he was working rapidly on this sketch, completing the contour and going on to the details. The person was completely unfamiliar to him. He didn't pay attention to this person till he heard them take a seat beside him. Naruto kept ignoring them because they didn't exchange words. They were moving around, pulling out a notepad and writing something next to him, and he could hear it. He resisted the urge to be a little curious. It wasn't until they patted his shoulder that he realized. He raised his head from his sketch and gave the newcomer a quick look. She was attractive and a girl. She had light pink/brownish hair that reached the middle of her back and was slightly wavy. Her eyes were warm and dark brown. Though Naruto would argue that it would have been usual for high school girls, with the exception of those at this specific high school, where it seemed that having a relatively large bust size was the norm. She was petite, but she had a good bust. Naruto was nervously and cutely chewing her lip when she pulled out her notepad, and his eyes wandered to the paper and read what she had written for him. It's good to meet you, and I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm Nishimiya Shouko, and I eat lunch here every day. Naruto looked at the paper, then up at her, wondering if she was mute, why she was writing to him, or if there was another reason why she was unable to talk. He read the words she had written for him as he looked down at the page once more. I want to be friends with you. Naruto nearly smiled at her candor as she set down the book and took a seat on the other side of the tree, reminding him of himself, at least as a child. My name is Uzumaki Naruto. I hope we can get along, Naruto said, nodding his head back at her after grabbing his pencil and playing with it while glancing back at the field. Naruto glanced back to the girl, who seemed a little embarrassed and confused. She handed him her notepad this time, and Naruto looked down at the page. He wasn't expecting another tap on his shoulder, but he was expecting some sort of reaction from her, maybe one of embarrassment or disdain. I'm sorry, could you repeat? I can't hear, but I can read lips. When he started writing with his own pencil, he avoided looking at her since it almost made him freeze. He was unprepared for this. He wasn't even certain whether he had heard of any individuals in the elemental nations who were deaf, but he could picture the hardships they would have faced. I'm hoping we'll get on. Uzumaki Naruto is my name. He returned the notebook before gauging her response. She blinked in surprise as she skimmed the page. Naruto gave him a small smile, suggesting that she was aware of him. He thought that everyone in this school had heard of him, not that he cared or anything. She started writing on the paper before showing it to him. Naruto read the lines. Does Uzumaki Naruto the Kuo have a criminal record? Shaka's mouth created a "oh" before she began writing again, and Naruto shook his head yes while he sweated nervously and then laughed lightly. I thought you would appear more menacing. It wasn't until someone spoke to him like a human being for the first time in his 3 years of life that he realized the paper was there. Before he reached for the notepad, Naruto actually offered her a slight but genuine grin, and she handed it to him. His shoulders seemed to be strangely relieved as he gazed at the paper. I could be scary if you wanted me to be. He showed it to her, and she bit her lip nervously before shaking her head no. Naruto glanced to her, felt her tap his shoulder, and smiled sweetly before writing something down again. While feigning to write, she was nodding her head no, and Naruto frowned as she indicated her lips. Naruto turned to her and asked, "This is how you want me to speak to you?" She grinned and nodded, and he frowned before continuing to write in her notebook. How come you can't hear? After he returned it to her, Shako silently glanced at the question and then slowly started typing a response, giving Naruto a small, sad smile that made it clear that she hated being deaf, despite the fact that there was nothing he could do about it. I was identified as clinically deaf due to significant hearing loss from birth. As he read that, Naruto scowled and said, "Deaf?" Since he is well versed in burdens, he knew that she wouldn't want to be pitied, and even when he thought about that, he realized that he would have hated it if he had been in her shoes. Dreamful hearing loss, he said, must be such a burden. He had never heard of such a thing, at least not until now. As an alternative, he only smiled gently at her and said, I'm sorry to hear that, taking care to speak clearly. To that point, Naruto looked over to the boys playing soccer, who were now taking a break and eating their sandwiches. Naruto took a few more bites out of his own sandwich before he started drawing again. He might have thought that the barrier between them made their comfortable silence uncomfortable, but he was clearly alluding to the fact that they could only communicate with each other by writing in a notebook. But he didn't mind the companionship. It was plenty for him, and they didn't have to talk. He was almost done reading the picture when he felt another hand on his shoulder, and he looked up at the girl, Nishimiya-san, who was holding a notebook and smiling shyly. The photo is beautiful, and you're doing great. Naruto smiled softly and held out his own hand. They were Hidevillage, who gestured to a boy with a long scarf around his neck and a funny pose. Udon, who gestured to another boy with glasses and a sickly expression, who was smiling quietly and holding a cardboard box above his head, and Moji, who this time gestured to the lone girl in the picture, who was pouting and looked very upset about something, even though her face was slightly flushed with embarrassment. When he finally drew himself next to Hidevillage, Naruto smiled quietly, smiling and pointed at the three of them while holding his palm on his stomach. Are you the last one? Naruto glanced at the page, nodded slightly, and pointed to himself before turning to Nishimiya. Yeah, the last one is me. I was much younger then, he replied. You seem so much happier now. Naruto looked at the text, then looked down at his photo, then wrote in the lower corner, and then smiled, but it was a small, sorrowful smile, and his eyes were watering. I was very content at the time. Naruto tore the paper out of his sketchbook before handing it to her, and she seemed surprised that he had done so, and she glanced at what he had written before looking up again, and when she offered him the sketch, he just shook his head and waved her away, as if to say that she could keep it, and Shako put the sketch in her bag before she started writing again. How did they do? Naruto didn't know how to respond to such a question. He couldn't just tell her outright that 3 of his buddies had perished along with almost everyone he loved, but what else could he say? He could tell a half-truth, or he could jest and see if she laughed. Naruto asked for the notebook again before writing something down for her to read. I moved quite a distance away. She frowned, bent her head, and made odd hand signals before writing in the journal. I'm sorry to hear that. Naruto moaned to himself, smiled at her, and dismissed her pity as the lunch bell rang. Then he packed his things in his bag, stood up, and waved to the girl, Nishimiya-san. A hand caught his sleeve as he was about to pass her again, and he raised an eyebrow in bewilderment before turning back to Shako, who seemed worried about something before hurriedly writing something down in her beautiful handwriting. Could we possibly eat lunch here tomorrow? The girl blushed a little but maintained eye contact with him as he knelt down in front of her and put a hand on her head. Naruto blinked briefly, and the girl's face changed from that of his former teammate in love to that of Nishimiya. He felt his smile waver a little before he ignored it. Naruto read the line again, then grinned slowly, and this time it was gentle, and he felt as though it was a real, sincere smile. Yeah, I'll be back for lunch tomorrow, he said, a little under his breath but clearly enough for her to understand. I hope to see you again, Nishimiya-san, he whispered. Perhaps it wouldn't be such a bad idea to let a few people into his life as acquaintances or even friends, and he stood up, carried his backpack, and headed to his classroom, feeling much better than he had in a long time. Ignoring the look he was getting from the girl he had just left behind, he walked through the crowd, lowering his eyes and putting his earbuds back in, since he had a soft spot for special cases, and Nishimiya-san wasn't a bad girl, and it seemed like she had had a difficult life up to this point, and he found it hard not to relate to that. Maybe he could go talk to Akeno-san again. He'll take her notes and offer an apology, saving her from Tashima-sensei's wrath. He went to the classroom and arrived a little early, not expecting to see Akeno seated at her desk right away, and after considering waiting for her outside in the hallway, he decided to enter the room before her. Naruto decided to take advantage of the opportunity to talk to the gorgeous woman with the raven hair. After Naruto approached her and awkwardly cleared his throat without looking at her, Akeno turned to look around and was a little surprised to discover a mortified and rather ashamed Naruto standing in front of her. He said, I hope you can forgive me for my rudeness earlier, Hajime-san, with a small bow. Akeno gaped openly at the tall boy, surprised to say the least, and he answered negatively because the blonde in front of him was pushed to the point where we were unable to emotionally register her intentions. This could still be the case with him, but if he were to return an hour later and apologize for his behavior, then he had been aware of his feelings the entire time and simply chose to act in the manner that he had. He had changed his mind and apologized for his sly behavior during the time she didn't see him, but it was strange that she couldn't help but smile even if she wanted to. It was interesting to see such a reaction from someone like him. It's alright, Uzumaki-san. I hope I didn't upset you earlier with any comments I had made. She was really pretty when she wasn't acting. Naruto looked up at her, blushing slightly as he blinked at her real smile. He heard the door behind him open, but he couldn't bring himself to turn around. He was still clearing his throat and scratching the back of his neck, even after all this time. Ah no, I just wasn't in the best of moods and I realized that I was being a dick, he muttered. He heard her laugh quietly before she cocked her head. Ara, Are you a grumpy boy? Naruto glared and stared again. I wouldn't say that. Akeno opened her eyes and collected herself as the first few students entered the class, and Naruto watched her as she laughed into her palm once again while shutting her eyes, her hand seeming lovely and soft. If it is convenient for you, I may deliver the notes to you after school. Oh, yeah, the notes, he muttered, wrinkling his nose in contempt. To be honest, he had forgotten about them. Even though he felt horrible about what he had done, he still wanted to take the darn notes. I guess so. I'll see you at the entrance after school, he answered, frowning slightly as he heard the Ravnet giggle behind him again, as if taunting him, and waved over his shoulder as he made his way back to his desk, avoiding the other children. Naruto looked owlishly at the girl in front of him, and he stopped when he almost bumped into Takagi Saya, the class representative, who was virtually glaring at him, with a notepad out for him and a hand on her hip. Saya sighed, pushed the notebook into his chest, crossed her arms, and turned her head. I had written these notes over lunch. The notes are everything that Sensei had gone over that will most likely be on any tests. Seeing as you aren't the smartest, I had made them simple and easy enough for you to understand, she said. Naruto grabbed the notepad and gazed at the cover, wondering why she would do this. Because, idiot, I am the class rep, and I should take responsibilities such as this into my power. Hajime-san shouldn't be bothered with giving out her notes, Saya replied. He looked over his shoulder at Akeno-san, who was normally doing a good job of hiding her frown, and asked himself, did he really say it aloud? He didn't think he did. Naruto went back to Saya and nodded his head, wearing a subtle smile. Thank you, Incho, he said as he passed her and took a seat at his desk in the back. I'll put them in writing immediately. Saya scowled as she watched him walk by, then turned to face Akeno, who gave her a seductive look before taking a seat in the middle of the classroom to get ready and gather her supplies. Having known for a while that the Takagi girl wasn't a great fan of hers, Akeno followed suit. She wasn't sure if this was because the genius girl was jealous of her or because she felt intimidated by her, but she could sense it was something far more severe than jealousy. In light of what she had said in class, she found it rather odd that she had decided to help Naruto, even though she couldn't be sure of her intentions or even if her assumption was correct. It seemed as if this one action had been an attempt to restore a barrier between Naruto and Akeno. It was a little awkward, though, and he almost started to sweat at the intense look the students were giving him at the moment, clearly using him as a sort of personal diversion. Teshima walked into his classroom to find everyone seated and prepared to go, and he felt some tension, though he wasn't sure what had happened. He glanced to the rear of the room and saw that Naruto was, for once, on time and in his seat. He blinked and even saw that the blonde's head was down and that he was writing something in a notebook, maybe some notes at last. He grinned excitedly, hoping that Naruto would finally take his life a bit more seriously than he had before. Maybe he could further stimulate the boy's interest with a good lesson to begin things off right now. All right, class. Welcome back, and I hope your lunch break was good. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask, or even write them down and come to me after class, he continued, offering to go over antiderivative and indefinite integrals that some of you might have found difficult to understand yesterday. The blonde never once looked up at him. With a, now let's begin, he picked up a pen and started writing on his whiteboard. When the day's end bell rang and they were told to leave this legal torture dungeon, Naruto groaned. He was exhausted and had seen enough people for one day, so he quickly packed his bags and left the room, resolved to depart for the day. Too many people, insufficient time for them. He quickly changed out of his school shoes and put on his sneakers before the majority of the pupils reached the entryway. He was unprepared for the jolt he felt as he opened the door, which made him take a step backwards as if someone had bumped into him. He heard the child groan from his spot on the ground and looked down at the man who had collided with him. Naruto glanced at the boy, who had a slight mullet and dark hair. He looked about average for his height and had an ordinary build. What the devil? I apologize, Uzumaki-san. I had no idea where I was heading. Please pardon me, or at the very least, don't beat me up! Boy grunted from the ground and looked up at the person he had run into. His brown eyes widened when he saw Nrada's face in front of him. The boy then squealed and skidded to Nrada's feet in a seiza position, with his head essentially touching the ground. Naruto felt his mouth tremble uneasily, not knowing what to say. A group of girls in towels or bikinis were slipping around the corner before he could reply. Wondering what in the world was happening, Naruto blanched. They all started pointing and shouting at him or the other person as they turned the corner, as if they had sensed something. Then, with all of their strength, they ran at the two of them. Sweat-soaked, the brunette on the ground squeaked again and stood up. Fear gave Naruto a chill he hadn't felt in a long time. The crowd of angry ladies running at them actually made him a bit nervous. He raised his eyebrows and then looked down at the utterly terrified man. Is every man for himself? Or? He grabbed the child by the hand, threw him over his back, and knelt down, saying, I will never desert a comrade in need. Oh, Uzumaki-san, what are you doing? The brunette yelled in a panic. After a quick look at him, Naruto stated, we're leaving, was all he mumbled before he began sprinting, trying to keep it as humanly fast as possible, because he knew that many people would ask him afterward how the fuck he managed to use shinobi speeds here, but Naruto wasn't interested in any of it. But racing the horde of angry women while carrying this other guy on his back reminded him of the time he ran a train and carried a princess, and yes, that was a good time. He rushed about the school for a time, trying to persuade the unusually persistent group to stop, but finally they all stopped due to exhaustion and went back to their normal pursuits. Oh wow, it's been a long time since he's pushed himself so much. He's been brooding for the past 3 years, not actually practicing, and he was panting and trying to catch his breath behind the tennis courts, near a woodland, and, if he was correct, near the old school building. He wiped the sweat from his cheeks, then scowled at the brunette before turning to face the boy who had caused him all of this trouble. What the devil was going on? After glancing at him briefly, the youngster stood up again and bowed too quickly for a healthy back. Thank you, Uzumaki-senpai. You are the best. Without you, I would have been completely destroyed. Naruto rubbed his neck and sighed in frustration. It's fine, I can't believe they even started chasing me, he muttered. The kid seemed dismissive. Well, given your reputation, Uzumaki-senpai, I truly thought they'd have stopped chasing me after they saw you. It's whatever. But again, who are you? Naruto murmured, stroking his matted hair. Oh, I had forgotten that. The youngster responded, standing up straight. I'm Hyudo Uzumaki-senpai, and I'm sorry if this has caused you any trouble. A fragment of the scene started to come together in Naruto's mind as he looked at Issei and comprehended what had happened. Hyudo-san, one of those perverts, aren't you? Are you familiar with me? Issei asked, seeming shocked. The thought made Naruto shudder. According to what he had learned about the perverted trio, the child's perversion might even be on par with that of his late sensei, yet he didn't even dispute being one. The super pervert may even be comparable to them. I've heard of you and your buddies, he said, explaining the reason the girls were pursuing you. Swim club. Issei wholeheartedly concurred. They just started warm-ups in those delicious school swimsuits. He grinned as he vividly pictured them, his face flushed and his nose widened. Naruto laughed softly at the expression, which he was too familiar with from his life to be affected by now, and shook his head before picking up his bag from the floor and starting to clean off the dirt. You know, Uzumaki-senpai, Issei said, drawing Naruto's attention. Naruto just arched a pale eyebrow, and Issei scratched his cheek sheepishly. I've heard a lot of bad things about you, but you aren't anything like what the rumors say about you, Issei replied. Who knows? I'm not interested in that sort of thing, Naruto said with a cheeky smirk. You really saved me there today, Issei said, grinning at him. Well, I'm sorry that you get so much shit then, she replied. I hope one day they'll see how cool you really are, she said. Whispered Naruto, like I said, it's no problem, but I doubt the school will be able to see me any different anytime soon. I'm already in my third year anyway. Well, maybe if you act this way with everyone, then they'll see, Issei said, glancing at him. It won't be as easy as that, Hyudu-san, remarked Naruto. People get set into their ideas, and it's hard to get them to acknowledge their wrongdoing, especially if some of them have been doing it for multiple years. But that's just how it works, especially in this world. Sometimes you just have to suck it up and accept your loss, the blonde said, as Issei didn't appear to be convinced by Naruto. Naruto started to walk away before Issei could speak another word. Take care, Hyudu-san, he said, tossing a hand over his shoulder. Hearing Issei say goodbye to his departing body, he put his hands in his pockets. It had been a long day, and he was tired. Normally, he could wait until he got home, but today was draining, and he suddenly felt the desire to smoke. He took out the packet, put a stick between his lips, already smelling the tobacco, and instead of lighting a lighter, he lit a small flame above his thumb with a very low-level cat and spirit art, lit the end of the cigarette, and took a deep puff, feeling the hot, dry smoke enter his lungs, a burning sensation so relieving that it gave him a strange sense of calm. Before he could survey his surroundings, he put out the smoke, having only caught sight of the building he stood before, a forest of trees enclosing the building, with stairs leading up to the front entrance, which was topped by a massive clock. It looked fairly old, though it had a new metal roof on top, and for the first time since he had been there he saw something that prevented him from taking another drag right then, the cigarette stopping on his lips, his eyes still focused on the open window, where a figure stood, staring at him. He looked like a deer caught in headlights. Naruto had never smoked at school previously, but after smelling cigarettes on him once, Teshima-sensei threatened to expel him immediately if he attempted to smoke on school grounds. They appear to take these issues quite seriously. But for now, he could not take his eyes off this person, and she just stood there, looking straight at him, her face very passive, and he could almost feel her disappointment even from a distance. Her eyes were beautiful blue-green, her hair was long, wild, and crimson. It was beautiful red hair. Her bust was large, almost as large as Akuna's. Her delicate hand was gripping the windowsill. Her high cheekbones and angular face made her look sophisticated. She held herself like royalty. For a minute Naruto recognized that he had pulled out the cigarette, lit it with a cat and spirit art, and taken a drag in front of her, and to be honest, the thing that worried him the most was the cat and spirit art. Naruto wasn't foolish enough to fail to recognize this person, despite the fact that his elevator didn't reach the top floor. She was one of the two great ladies of Kuo Academy, a beautiful girl who was in and out and upside down. He was a little worried about what had happened at this exact moment because he knew that she was close to the student council and that she had a lot of power in Kuo Academy and Kuo Town. Indeed, he knew exactly who this person was. Gremory Rias,